So this basic concept of word, picture, connection, and how you can play with that, and use defamiliarization so that you are able to see these concepts quite objectively and question them to some extent. Of course, that applies more broadly to larger narratives in our culture, things that we grow up with that are very familiar, and to some extent they become invisible. We take them for granted. And well, the case of the rabbits, that's a fairly good example, because it's a story that, at least for myself as an Australian and growing up with the Australian education system and so on, I'm overly familiar with. That is our colonial history and how it was that Europeans first arrived on the continent, and the conflicts they had with Indigenous people. Almost so well known that it's a little bit of a boring subject. If somebody sort of started saying, particularly in school, okay, let's talk about Captain James Cook coming to Australia, it'd just be like your eyes glaze over, and it's like, yeah, whatever, some Europeans came on a ship and so on and so on. The sad thing about that is that you forget how amazing that was as an event in history, like conceptually how profound it is for one culture, particularly from a industrialised Western Europe, coming down to another culture which has a completely different lifestyle, totally different understanding of the perimeter of the universe, and spiritually how it works, and that these two cultures physically come together and confront each other across thousands of years of human separation. In order to really appreciate that, it's not enough to draw a picture of James Cook because it's too familiar, and we just sort of switch off a little bit. At least I think an Australian reader would switch off a little bit seeing those images, because we think we already know it, but the truth is we don't. We don't really know it. So drawing the Europeans as strange alien creatures, and then also drawing the Indigenous characters as unrecognisable native animals, somehow helps us to step back as readers, and for myself as an artist, to step back and look at the situation and actually assess it as if it is happening for the first time, and I've never come across this story before. And then I realise how utterly bizarre the whole situation is. So in some ways, people look at the resulting illustrations and their first impression may be that it's like science fiction or fantasy, that it's elaborate and strange and like a flight of fancy. But what I'm really trying to do is get closer to reality, to actually bypass the problem of recognition of a known story, and allow people to look at it fresh again, and for myself to make it very interesting again. So the fantasy elements or the surrealist elements are actually a way of getting closer to the feeling of reacting without language or without knowledge or wisdom to something as it's happening, and thinking about it more or less from a childlike point of view, but with a certain level of adult sophistication.